And now we'll be moving on to part 2 of the avatar creator tutorial, where we'll be looking at the implementation of how to actually build out this web application using a Next.js application and the Rive React runtime. So as you saw in previous avatar creator tutorials, how this kind of looks is you can choose different facets of your avatar, such as the eyes, the body shape, and the hair even, and see it kind of reflect in this left panel preview here as you choose some of these different options. And the nice thing about this in this web application is that it works in this desktop view, but also in a mobile view as well. So it's a little more responsive. When we choose different things here, we can still go back to desktop view. And if you haven't checked out our React documentation yet for Rive, you can go to help.rive.app and see in the runtime section, this React section here, you'll see some quick start guides and getting started guides on how to easily integrate Rive into your React-based applications. So let's get started. So just as a recap from the previous videos, let's take a quick look into the Rive file to see how this is structured and how we'll be using it in our Next.js application. So we've got kind of 3 main artboards that we're going to be working with. The first one is the avatar. This correlates to the main preview window that you're seeing here. And we've also got these different icon artboards. So we've got body color icon, body size icon, body eyes icon, and so forth. And so these will correlate to the different icons that you see here in this top bar when choosing which icon you want to change the feature of. And then lastly, we have this body color button, body size button, body eyes button, very similar to the body icon button. But you'll notice that, in each of these sections, we have multiple of these buttons, but we only see one button here. And we're going to be making different instances of Rive, in this case, making multiple copies of the artboard you could imagine, as well as their state machines to basically replicate all these different options on your application. And so depending on how many options there are for the body color, that's how many copies of the body color we're going to make here. So in this case, 5. And so we'll see what that looks like in code in a bit. But the nice thing about this is that it keeps the file size down. You don't have to make an artboard and a state machine and all different animations for all the different possibilities of options that go into creating the avatar. You only have to make one of each, and we'll see why in a bit. But it also makes the state machine practical. So as an implementer, don't have to go in and try and create an instance and rename each instance of Rive with a different artboard name and a different state machine name. I can reuse the same artboard name when I'm making multiple copies of these things in code. And if the naming of the artboard name and the state machine name and the state machine inputs are pretty predictable in terms of the designer and myself collaborating and making a good pattern of how we're going to be reusing this artboard across multiple instances of Rive in code, it makes it a lot easier to create these patterns at runtime. Now, I wanted to quickly go over how to export your Rive files into your Next.js application. So we'll go into this share button here, and in this download flyout, you'll see this for runtime.rav button here. So I'm going to click that, and you'll see it downloads it to my Chrome browser here. And I've already got this set up, but you can drag it into your Next.js application. And for the purposes of this tutorial, I've already scaffolded this avatar builder project using the Create Next app starter CLI tool, which scaffolds a whole Next.js application with the latest version of Next.js. It's also set up Tailwind CSS, which is the tooling we'll be using to build out the UI and the CSS for this project, among some other tooling that I don't need to fuss with. But you'll notice here I've got this public folder, and this is where all my public accessible assets are going to live. So you'll see some SVG files, you can put in your favicon files, and in this case, we're going to include our Rive files, the .rav extension ones, in the public folder as well, because this will be publicly accessible whenever I deploy this application to the internet, and that's what I want my runtime to look for. And you'll see why that is in a bit. But it's certainly not the only way you can import Rive files into your Next.js applications. You could also deploy your .rav files onto a CDN, for example, like AWS S3 or a Google bucket, and pull in the Rive file via a URL as well. So there are different ways to import the Rive files, and you can just check the documentation on which way might work best for you. Now looking at some of the components of this project, if we drill down into this, You'll notice we have a components folder. This is where I'm going to be storing some components that we'll be using throughout the application. We've got this avatar component, icon buttons, the containers that generate all the icons and things as such. And we'll be looking into kind of how this looks in the bigger picture when we construct our web application a little later. But we've also got this app folder where we've set our context and this avatar state file. Now, for this application, want to set up this kind of global context state so that it can be shared across all components, but also any component in my React hierarchy tree can update the global state as needed so that the other components around the React tree can get those latest values. And you'll see kind of why we need that to happen. But when you can imagine when a user is clicking on a certain mustache for the facial hair, we want the avatar component that's completely unrelated to that button option to know when that mustache is chosen so that it can reflect having a mustache chosen in the preview window. And so this is why we'll need a global state. Now you'll see here in this avatar state file, I've got this initial state set up, and it's just kind of a big object. We've got this active icon string here, and it's referring to part of an artboard name. And this will refer to the actual icon that's chosen. So if we're looking at facial hair options, we've got the facial hair active icon set. Or if we're looking at background color, the background color active icon will be set. And so this kind of correlates to the naming of the artboard for body color icon and body face hair icon and things like that. And then we've also got this object mapping here of Rive avatar selections where we've got a mapping from a string called body color, body size, to some number. And if you recall in the Rive file, these different options will correlate to the button options. So the color, the size, the eyes, that all makes sense. But the number, it refers to a number input in each of those option buttons called num option. And the num option for 0, for 1, for 2, etc. for each of those buttons correlate to a different option value. So 0 might be mustache, 1 might be hairless facial features, and 2 might be referring to a beard, things of that nature. And so each number has significance here for each of these, the body color, the size, the eyes, and so forth. And so we want to store that mapping of what the user has chosen in each of those option grid containers back into the central state so that the avatar preview can read those new values and reflect the correct avatar accordingly. So this is why we have set up our state that way. And we're going to be using a reducer pattern to essentially make it easy for components to change the state, the global state, in a way that it's safe. And this is an easy testable pattern. You can read more about the use reducer and the use context hooks in the React documentation. But we've got these two functions here, set active icon and set Rive avatar selection. So when set active icon is called, this is when a user clicks on different icons in the icon bar. And the set Rive avatar selection is when an option is selected for a given icon. And then we kind of wrap this in this provider component, and this is kind of what wraps the entire React tree so that any component under it can call some of these helper functions to change state accordingly. And the last thing I wanted to look at is this avatar config.json file. And so if you recall, in the option button state machines in the Rive file, we had a number input for the state machine called num option, and this num option could have a value for 0 to even 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever it might be, depending on how many options there were for a given character trait. For example, in body color, there were about 5 options, and in the eyes, there were 4 options, and so forth. And so we create this JSON file in code just to keep track of how many option values there are and how many copies of the option buttons that we need to create that grid of options that the user can choose from. So we have this JSON config here, and we're going to be reading this in as we kind of load up the Next.js application and pass this data down to our components so it knows how many eye options and size buttons and so forth to create when we render that out on the UI. And so digging a bit into the hierarchy here, we're starting off with our page component or page.tsx file with this home component here. And you'll see everything's kind of wrapped in this main block. I'm going to ignore a lot of this Tailwind CSS syntax here that you see in a lot of the class names for this project. But you'll also see this avatar state provider that's wrapping this main entry component. This provider is what provides the global state and the actions to update the state to all the components below it. And then this Rive main entry is where we'll kind of dig into, but you'll notice that we're passing in this local data block. This local data block is that JSON file essentially that we went over that dictates how many options there are for each of the character or avatar traits here. So this is important when we figure out how many buttons to generate and things like that. But moving on to the Rive main entry component, you'll see there's a lot more divs and a lot more tags here that are dealt with basically maintaining the layout and style of this whole application. And so I'm going to avoid a lot of the style talk in here, but you can peruse the Tailwind CSS docs and also the source code at another time. Really what I want to start with is this Rive avatar component. So if we dig into Rive avatar, you'll see here that we are importing at the top the React runtime, and we're going to be importing some relevant hooks and some other enum values that we're going to be using when we instantiate Rive. So with this Rive avatar component, we are calling the use Rive component hook here and providing some relevant details for what to render essentially onto a canvas. And so you can see we're giving it the name of the Rive file at the path where our publicly accessible asset is going to be. So because that public folder is going to expose all the assets at its root, I'm giving it basically a shallow relative path to the root of the application and thus the avatar demo.rav file. I'm also passing it the artboard name here and the name of the state machine. In this case, I made it a constant. So layout params and basically telling it to autoplay to true. I'm also pulling in the context here, which is basically going to give me the global state of everything in this application. And this is going to be relevant because when I choose different options for some of these avatar traits, I want the avatar character here to know what those are so that it can reflect that accordingly. And here I'm basically pulling in a reference to all the state machine inputs that go into making this state machine. And you'll notice that there's state machine inputs for the body color, the body size, and the values for these number inputs here will actually correlate to the number value that is selected for a given trait here. So if this is 0 or if this is 2, and I click 2 here, this should update the num body color to a value of 2 as well. And that's why we kind of have this use effect block down here. And what this is doing is it's looking for all these values from Rive avatar selections, which comes from the global state. And it's trying to read the latest values for each of these different avatar traits and set these on the number input accordingly so that the avatar can update. And so this use effect is essentially just looking for those changed values. And the other thing that it's doing is when it notices a changed value and executes this use effect block, it's calling this changes trigger.fire. And this state machine has an extra trigger input that when fired kind of gives it an extra bounce to visually indicate to the user, like we saw in the previous videos, that a change has happened. So there's that little bounce there. And then we're rendering the Rive component down here in the return statement. But going back to the Rive main entry, one other thing I want to call out is for the desktop views, I'm setting an aspect ratio of 1:1 in Tailwind that's dictated by aspect square. And the reason for that is because the artboard size in the Rive file for this avatar artboard is actually a 1:1 aspect ratio. And so it's definitely important to make a container when rendering the Rive file of the similar aspect ratio. And sometimes that makes a difference, sometimes not. But in this case, in order to kind of lay things out accordingly, this is important. And so giving it an aspect ratio here made the most sense for figuring out the scale of its width and height. Now let's take a look at the icons here. And so with icons, we're going to be looking at this top bar that dictates which icon and which pair of options we're going to be looking at. So if we go back to our Rive main entry components, we've already looked at the Rive avatar bit. Now we're going to go down to this lower block in this render part of the function and look at this icon container block. We're going to ignore this Rive options container for a second here, but going into this Rive icons container, You can see it's a separate component that we've created, and it's pretty basic. It's very small. It's called Rive icons container, and it's just got a div that's containing basically all these different options. And you can see that we've hard-coded about, 6 different icons here that each correlate to the different avatar traits. And so because there are only 6, it makes it pretty easy to just hard-code this in. We don't have to be smart about programmatically trying to generate these. But of course, you could probably get pretty clever with the way that you set up the state machines, set the names and things like that. What we're doing here is we're creating a Rive icon button for each avatar trait, and we're passing in this artboard name, basically dictating this reusable component, Rive icon button, which artboard should this icon render. And so we're doing it for the color, the eyes, the size, and things like that. And we're using this helper function to basically extrapolate the exact artboard name that we want to render. And so if we pass in color, we want to make sure that this is actually body color icon as the artboard name we want to render. But in total, really the takeaway here is that we are reusing this Rive icon button component here to render out all the different icons, and that we don't have to have a specific React component for each of the different character traits. We can just reuse one, which is the nice power of React. If we dive into the Rive icon button, you'll see that it looks kind of similar to the Rive avatar component that we looked at earlier, in that yes, we're importing the React canvas runtime and those hooks that seem familiar. They use Rive and use state machine input. And so again, we are pulling in the Rive file, the artboard name, and this time we're not explicitly calling out the artboard name. We are taking it from the props here, the artboard name that we passed in from the parent component. And we are also passing in the name of the state machine, which is again a constant. And we are disabling the listeners here. In the Rive file, it actually has listeners so that at design time, you could see the interaction of what happens when you click on the button and things like that. We're going to disable that because we're going to set that up all programmatically for accessibility purposes. Now, the next thing I want to look at is this variable that we're creating here called strip down name. Now, if you remember, we passed in this component the artboard name, right? And we, for example, in this case, this would be body color icon. And what we want to do is we want to strip out that icon part from the string so that we're just left with body color. Now, the reason we want to do that is because we use body color in the state machine input name for num body color for the icon. And that way we can set the actual value for the icon here. And so we're manipulating that state machine input. We're creating a reference to it here called num option. When we use the use state machine input to grab a reference to that state machine input, we are essentially using the num and then the strip down name. So this is using some string interpolation to essentially get num body color, essentially. When we create references to these, this is why we need the strip down name. We don't want the icon part in there. Now I'm going to go down to this use effect where we look at the num option. And so in this use effect, what we're doing is we're setting the num option for the icon, which is going to dictate basically what selection is reflected from the user's choice here. So if they chose purple, this icon should reflect purple. And so this num option here is being updated with that latest value. And that's because it's reading from, again, we have global state pulling in from that use context here, and reading the latest value that was chosen by the user from the options. And so that options is stored as a number in the mapping in our global state, and we are just updating the num input here for the icon, its state machine, to reflect that new value. Now, just to show you kind of what this looks like without this use effect, if we didn't listen to the global state and we didn't set that num option input for this specific input in the state machine, you would see that as we choose different options here, it remains the same value at whatever it was set either initially when the state machine is run or when the user last set that value. And so for this reason, because we are changing the options here, we need this use effect to basically listen for changes in those values so that we can accurately reflect the color changed here. We also want to have this use effect below it to look at the stripped down name, because we want to see, is this icon actually active or not? Again, because we're using a generalized component for all icons, we need to make sure that we set whether or not a given icon is active based on whether or not the user has selected it. And by active, I mean given this kind of border, you can see a bit here. If I zoom in a bit, you can see that it's got this kind of halo background a bit outlined to dictate that, hey, this is the active icon of options that we're looking at. And we are just setting a state machine input for that for each of the state machines here to off or false, 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 and for the one that I selected as true. So we are essentially using this use effect to listen to whatever the user has selected there for the is icon active state machine input. And we're going to be using React callbacks here, the use callback hooks here, to essentially coordinate some of the smaller interaction pieces manually. So things that were set up in the Rive file as listeners for hovering and clicking interactions, we're going to be ignoring those as we called the should disable listeners flag above in the use Rive hook. And we're going to be manipulating those state machine inputs manually. So you'll see we have a reference to the is hovered state machine input here. And we're setting it to true or false whether or not we blur on it and giving it a better accessible experience that way. You'll notice that we've wrapped the Rive component, which is the icon, in a button component. And so this gives us a nice way to get some easy accessibility features just by wrapping it in a button. And the last thing I want to mention is that on click of a certain icon, we are not only giving it the active style here, we're also calling this set active icon function with the artboard name that is given here. So in this case, body eyes icon. And the set active icon comes from an exposed function from our use context that we called above. And again, how I mentioned earlier, we are exposing not only the global state, but in a way to easily update the state from any given component. This is one of those functions that allows us to update from this particular component which icon is being actively looked at, so that later on we can look at the different options in this grid here for the given icon that was tapped. And so this is important for setting the context of what was chosen. And now the next thing we want to look at are the actual option button components here in the container that shows the options in a grid kind of format. And you'll notice these are kind of dynamic in the number of options per avatar feature here. And so we'll take a look at how that happens. And so at the top of the main entry, we're again pulling in our global state, this time to look at the active icon. The active icon is again either like body color or body eyes. It's a string that dictates the icon of the trait that the user wants to select an option for. And what we want to do here is we want to essentially trim down that string to the core trait that we're looking at. So for example, with body color, we want to trim out the body string here and just get the string color. Or for body eyes icon, we want to trim out the body part and just get eyes. And if it's just background color, this is a special exception. We'll just take background color. Now, why we want to do that is because if we look into our local data, we are, this is again the config that dictates how many options there are per avatar trait. So for color, there are 5 options and things like that. And we want to essentially get for each of the active, which is the active icon, which is eyes or color, whatever, and just get the key mapping for this, the string here. And what we're going to do with that is at the very bottom of our return function, in our Rive options container, which we're going to take a look at, you'll see that we're taking that trimmed active icon. So this would just be color, size, eyes, as you can see here in this preview, and just trying to get that simple string. We're also going to be looking at that JSON data and trying to find the mapping of how many options there are for the given chosen option. So if the user has chosen, for example, facial hair, they'll get face hair as the trimmed icon string and get the num options and set 3 for the prop for this num options prop. And so again, this would be face hair and this would be 3 essentially. So we were just trying to pare down the data to what is the active icon and trying to map that to our hard-coded JSON data to see how many options this Rive options container needs to generate dynamically for this grid. So let's move into the Rive options container. All right, so moving into the Rive options container component, you'll see this looks somewhat similar to the Rive icons container component. In the Rive icons container component, though, we did not dynamically generate however many options or icons there were. We knew there were a fixed number of avatar traits. There were 6 of them. So we hard-coded 6 Rive icon component buttons for this container. In this Rive options container, though, again, we are taking those props of what is the actual thing that we are wanting to generate the buttons for, in this case, face hair, and how many options there are from our JSON data. Again, that would be 3. And we are taking those collective traits and props that are passed into this component and essentially generating dynamically these Rive option button components that dictate each of these different options here. And so essentially that's all this container component is doing. It's dynamically creating some of these Rive option buttons based on the naming and the pattern of how we named the artboard, how things are named in our global state, and things like that. So you can take a deeper look into the state code and how things are updating and how things are parsed here. But this is essentially all this container is it's generating buttons. Now looking at what this is generating for each button, it's this Rive option button component. And we are passing it 3 props. One is the key, which is standard in React when you're iterating and creating multiple components. And we're also passing in the artboard name, which is calling this helper function to essentially format the artboard name that we want to render. And then we're also passing in this option IDX, or short for index, prop here with I. And I is coming from this loop that we're iterating over from 0 to the number of options that we need to generate. And we're going to be using this to actually dictate the number option that each button should display for num option, the number input, in the state machine for this artboard. So again, we're only using one artboard here, which is, in this case, this would be body face hair button, option button. And the state machine has a num option input that goes from, that's enumerated from 0 to however many number options there are for a given avatar trait. For example, in body hair option button, artboard here, there are about 11 different options here. And so each one is going to have its own option IDX of 0, 1, 2, 3, and so forth until it gets to the end. And again, that's dictated by the number of options that were passed into the container for the chosen icon. Now moving on to the Rive option button component, you'll see here we're getting these props again, the artboard name, which is going to determine which artboard we're going to render, and the option IDX prop, which is a number that dictates what number each Rive instance is given when rendered, and it's going to map to that num option input in the state machine when for these option button artboards. And so starting off, again, this looks very similar to how we instantiated the avatar and also the icon. We are pulling in the React canvas in runtime and importing the use Rive and use state machine hooks. And we are calling in that Rive source here from the avatar demo.riv file, the artboard name given from the props, and the state machine name, which is also, again, a constant. We are setting autoplay to true, and then we are, again, disabling the listeners that are set on the buttons here, because, again, we want to provide a more accessible experience by manipulating the state machine input directly. And you'll see down below when we return, what we return from this component is a button wrapping that Rive component. So again, we are using the accessibility features of being wrapped inside of a button to be able to handle a lot of things such as tab accessibility and things like that. Starting from the top, what we want to do is look at this main name variable. We are essentially taking the artboard name and replacing the word button from it. Again, you can imagine each of these button components is one of these is what we're rendering. This would be body color button, and we want to remove the button part of that string, so we're just left with body color. And the reason we're going to do that is because we're going to be using that as the key for traversing our global state. So for body color, when we look back at our global state, we're just looking at the body colors thing. And we are also just looking at the value that it is set to in our state as well. So going back here, toggle that off. We just want to get the selection value of what was chosen before. So for example, if we went back to the hair, you can see that this value would be set to 2 because it's starting from 0, 1, 2. Similarly with the background color, you can see that this is slightly set to active. And so the value here would be 0, 1, 2 as well for the body color, the background color. Now moving down along the lines, we'll see we have similar functions for the onFocus, onBlur, and onClick callbacks that we attach to our button here. And these just kind of help dictate, is a button hovered, is a thing clicked, and setting its kind of active state here. You can see it's a little darker. Now, when you click on one of these buttons, you'll see if we look into this onClick function, we're calling this set Rive avatar selection. And if you remember, set Rive avatar selection comes from our use context hook here. And this is one of those other functions that updates our global state. Just like we had an icon, we had set active icon function that we called on the onClick function for each of the icons to dictate, which icon we're going to be looking at. And similarly, for these buttons, when you click on one, we're going to be calling the set Rive avatar selection button with the name of what we're updating, so in this case, body color, and the actual value correlated to which option was selected. So in this case, it would be 0, 1, 2, 3. And so here, this is how we kind of make the magic happen of updating the global state of which trait selection was made by a user. So whenever a user clicks one of these options, that value is updated in our avatar state for this body color here. And then this is read from the avatar component to update accordingly, and again, give it that bounds to show that something updated. So that's kind of the magic of it all, of how updating global state in one component can lead to making a change, not only in this actually avatar component here, but also in this icon over here. You can see it reflecting the change when we traverse all the different colors and options here. And you can see here above, we are also just setting is icon active for any given button based on whether or not it maps the selected value. So for example, if we go to the hair icon here, you'll see that it's not just the first button that's highlighted, as you would expect, like at the default. It's the actual hair icon that it was selected previously that is highlighted. And so you'll see is icon active. We have this fourth parameter to use state machine input. And this is kind of what you can set as a default value when the Rive instance is made and when the state machine is set up. And so this will evaluate to a true or false value here, basically determining whether or not the actual value for a given button should be highlighted or not, as it's creating all these different buttons based on if it's selected in the state. And similarly, you can see in this use effect just below it, we are setting the isIcon active.value for any given button when a selection is clicked. And so you can see here, it's iterating over each of these buttons and seeing, hey, is this correlated to the chosen option? And if not, don't just set the value to false or keep it as it is. And if I choose a new option, we'll set that is active icon value to true. And for the sizing of it, you'll notice that the size of the button is not directly a 1-to-1 aspect ratio as you saw for the icon and this avatar preview. It's a different aspect ratio, but again, we're taking that into account as we're creating the CSS values for the button. And the Rive component will scale with the button parent component, and so we don't have to worry about setting any class names on the Rive component here. Another thing to call out is this line here, or these few lines here for the num option variable. What we're doing is calling that use state machine input for the num option reference. So the num option state machine input we want to grab a reference to. And we're setting a fourth parameter here with option IDX, which is again the number that we want to set the state machine input value to. So as we're iterating and creating each of these buttons, for example, with the hair option, we're iterating 11 times to create each of these buttons, and each button is going to be given an option IDX of 0, 1, 2. And as we're creating these buttons, when it goes to create the state machine and get a reference to the num option input, it's setting each of these to default values of 0, 1, 2, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how we enumerate all the different hair options, all the different eye options, just based on that JSON data file that we created in the project that dictates how many options to create per trait for the avatar. And that's kind of how we enumerate all the different buttons here by using this use state machine input and setting the num option for the state machine to a different value every time we iterate and create one of these Rive option buttons. Now, just to show you kind of what would happen if we didn't instantiate a default value for this num option variable, what would happen is if we took out this fourth parameter for option ID x, note that the first and last colors here are this blue and purplish color. Now, if we took away that default value, reset this, you'll see we actually only render the last value for each of these buttons. And same thing with all the rest of the icons. We're only showing off the last option as a value. And the reason for that is because the state machine is never instantiated with a number option to show when it's choosing all these things. And so it's important to kind of instantiate sometimes the default value, especially if you're iteratively enumerating different artboard, Rive instances, Rive artboards, and things like that in this kind of manner when you're generating multiple instances. And similarly for the isIconActive variable here for the useStateMachine input, if we did not provide a fourth parameter, what would happen is that the active icon would be reset every time we revisited an icon, and it wouldn't remember exactly which button or option to activate as the active selected one. And so this is why it's important to sometimes default and keep track of the state of, what things were selected, especially in a kind of scenario like this use case. And that's the avatar creator. You'll find links to the source code that you can peruse on your own time in the description box, so you can check out all the extra details such as the styling, how we made things responsive in the mobile view, and other concerns like that. Now, you could take this even a step further if you were to fork this project and actually include it in your own applications. Right here, it's kind of just a prototype. You can, of course, change different traits of the avatar, and that's all fine and dandy, but you can make this a lot more interesting if, for example, you captured the state, the global state of what was chosen and selections for this avatar, and perhaps store that in a database for a given profile user so that you could use the avatar to actually build an actual profile avatar creator for your product. And so that's just one way you could kind of extend this prototype to integrate it into your own applications as well. If you have any questions or concerns about the implementation or even how things are built in the Rive editor, feel free to join our Discord community to leave a comment on this. And thanks for choosing Rive.